The supply truck came in from the east, which was already wrong. Eastbound convoys carried food, fuel, and mail. They carried replacement batteries and bulk medical supplies and crates of bottled water that sweated through their cardboard skins before anyone could stack them properly. They did not carry operators. They did not carry assets. And they absolutely did not carry women who weighed maybe 130 pounds and stepped down from the passenger side with a duffel bag slung over one shoulder and nothing else. Senior Chief Petty Officer Darren Holloway watched her from the shade of the motor pool overhang and said nothing. He had learned, over 22 years in naval special warfare, that the first thing you said was usually the wrong thing, and that the desert had a way of punishing anyone who moved too fast in it. The heat here was not the summer heat of anywhere else. He'd been not Virginia Beach, not California, not the jungles that had their own kind of punishing warmth. This was a flat, architectural heat, like standing inside something. It took the energy out of rapid movement and made stillness the natural state. He was still. He watched. She was short 5'4", maybe 5'5" in boots. Sand-colored hair pulled back tight under a faded cap. Civilian issue, not military. Her trousers were the right pattern, but the wrong cut. Like she'd bought them at a surplus store 3 states away and never bothered to have them altered. She wore no rank. She wore no unit patch. She carried a long case, matte black with foam-padded latches, that she transferred from her left hand to her right without any apparent effort. One of the newer guys, Petty Officer 3rd Class Tyler Renfrew, 23 years old and still believing that loudness was the same as confidence, walked out into the sun and looked at her the way you'd look at a car that pulled into the wrong parking lot. "Supplies over there," he said. He pointed. She looked at him. Then she looked at where he was pointing. "I'm not supply," she said. Her voice was flat. Not unfriendly, just flat. The way a topo map is flat, it carries all the information, just without decoration. Renfrew glanced back at Holloway. Holloway made no expression. Renfrew turned back to the woman. "You got orders?" She reached into the front pocket of her duffel, produced a folded sheet, and handed it to him. He read it. His face changed once, then went neutral again. He handed it back. "You're the ISR attachment? Temporary support," she said. "That's all the paperwork says, right?" He looked at the long case. "What's in the equipment?" He waited for her to say more. She didn't. Holloway came out of the shade. He was a big man, not tall but wide, with forearms that looked like they'd been carved from something denser than ordinary flesh. He took the orders from the woman without being offered them, read them the same way Renfrew had, and handed them back the same way. "We leave at 0400, he said. "I know," she said. "Chow's at 1800. Berthing's in Block C, second door on the left." "I know." He looked at her for one more second. She met the look without returning it, which was a distinction he noticed. "All right," he said. He went back into the shade. Behind him, Renfrew caught the eye of Staff Sergeant Will Decker, who was sitting on an equipment case cleaning a pistol with the unhurried focus of a man who had done this 10,000 times. Renfrew mouthed something. Decker shook his head slightly. "Not worth it," the sheik said. Renfrew looked back at the woman, who was already walking toward Block C, her duffel over one shoulder and the long case hanging at her side. "1 minute, Renfrew said, quietly, to no one in particular. Decker looked at the pistol. "Don't," Decker said. "She won't last a minute out there. Don't." Dinner was rice and something that had once been chicken. She ate alone at the far end of the table, not because she'd been asked to, but because the space was available, and she preferred it. Around her, the team moved through the comfortable rituals of men who had spent years in close quarters, the particular shorthand of inside jokes that didn't need setup, the muscle memory of passing things without being asked, the practiced loudness that was its own form of communication. She ate. She was quiet enough that conversations happened around her like water around a stone. Said she's never been downrange. ISR attachment. What does that even mean in this context? Look at her. Decker. I'm serious. Decker was sitting 3 seats away from her, and he ate his food and didn't look at anything in particular. After dinner, she sat in the open common area while the light died outside and worked through her equipment case with a methodical patience that was itself a kind of silence. She broke down the rifle system component by component, inspected each one with a penlight between her teeth, and reassembled it with movements so practiced they had stopped being movements and become something closer to breathing. Petty Officer 1st Class Marcus Webb came and sat across the table from her. Webb was the team's senior sniper. 3 combat deployments, 1 confirmed kill at a distance that had made a small footnote in training manuals. He was 31 years old and absolutely certain of his own competence, which in his case was not arrogance, but simple arithmetic. He watched her work. Accuracy International, he said, after a moment. AXMC. She didn't look up. Yes. What round? 338 lapua. He was quiet. She finished the inspection of the firing mechanism and set it aside. That's a long-range platform, he said. Yes. What's your background? She looked up at him then. Not hostile, just assessing. The way you'd assess terrain. Quiet professional, she said. He almost smiled. It was an old phrase, SEALs and their equivalents, the ones who didn't talk about what they did. He nodded once and stood up. We'll see. he said. She watched him go. Then she went back to the rifle. Outside, behind the motor pool, Renfrew was standing with two other men, Petty Officer 2nd Class Grant Okafor and a Marine liaison named Derek Finch, who had been attached to the team for 2 weeks and would be attached for 2 more. They were smoking, which was technically prohibited, in a technically prohibited location, which was itself a tradition. She can barely carry the case, Renfrew said. She carried it fine, Okafor said. I'm saying she's small. For the platform, AXMC's a heavy setup. Webb runs a heavier setup. Webb's different. Okafor looked at the cigarette in his hand. Finch looked at the sky. Neither of them spoke, which was its own kind of answer. 1 minute, Renfrew said again, with more confidence this time. I've seen guys with 3 times the experience and twice the size wash out of this kind of op. What's her name? Finch asked. Renfrew stopped. What? Her name. You've been talking about her for an hour. What's her name? Renfrew didn't know. He'd looked at her orders, they'd all looked at the orders when Holloway wasn't watching, and the name had been there, 1 line above the authorization block, and none of them had retained it. Finch flicked his cigarette into the dirt. That's what I thought, he said, and went inside. Her name was Claire Whitmore. She did not sleep much. She had not slept much in 4 years, and had mostly made peace with it. She lay on the cot in Block C and listened to the desert breathe the specific ventilation of that landscape, the way the air moved differently out here than it moved anywhere else. Thicker with heat even after dark, carrying the smell of something mineral and ancient. In her mind she ran through calculations. Not because she needed to, the calculations were as automatic as her heartbeat by now, but because running through them was a form of calm. Wind at altitude, drop over distance, the relationship between temperature and muzzle velocity, the breathing discipline that made the space between heartbeats long enough to matter. She thought about a man named Robert Whitmore, who had been her father, and who had taught her these things before the army had. She thought about a valley in a country she was not permitted to name, where she had made a shot at an impossible distance under circumstances that had ended her career and changed her life and kept 3 men alive. She thought, I am not here to prove anything. She thought it until she believed it. Then she stopped thinking and listened to the desert, and at some point sleep came for her the way it always came, quietly, without announcement, like a professional. At 0330 she was already dressed and outside. The sky was that particular pre-dawn color that has no good name, not black, not gray, not blue, something between all three, like a bruise healing backward. She sat on equipment case outside Block C with her notebook open on her knee and a pen in her hand. She was not writing. She was watching the flags. The base had 3 of them, 1 at the main gate, 1 above the comms building, 1 at the edge of the motor pool. They were moving. She was measuring how they moved, the specific quality of the motion, the period and amplitude of the flutter, the deviation angle under load, and from those measurements extracting the surface, wind speed and direction to within perhaps half a kilometer per hour and 5 degrees of bearing. This was something her father had taught her before she could drive a car. Look at what's moving, he'd said. The world is always telling you the wind. You just have to decide to listen. She wrote the surface measurement in the notebook. Then she looked at the terrain to the northeast, the ridge line that would matter tomorrow, and began the second calculation, the gradient effect. Wind at altitude was not wind at the surface. The relationship between the two was shaped by terrain, by temperature differential, by the convective behavior of the specific ground between here and there. The wadi that cut through the mid-distance was a channel. Channels accelerated air. The saddle between the 2 peaks of the northeast spur was a convergence point, 2 flows meeting, interacting, the resultant behavior predictable if you had enough reference data. She had been collecting reference data since she arrived. Staff Sergeant Decker found her there because he couldn't sleep either. He sat down 2 feet away from her and didn't say anything for a while. He was good at not saying anything. It was one of the reasons Holloway trusted him. He looked at the flags. He looked at her notebook. The notebook was covered in numbers. Columns of numbers, no labels, no legend. Just values and calculations and occasional geometric sketches that looked like cross-sections of terrain. Distance to the ridge line, he said. It wasn't a question. She looked at him. Northeast spur, she said. Approximately 3,100 meters. The ground between here and there breaks into 3 elevation tiers, which affects wind shear at altitude. He was quiet. You mapped it last night? I walked it with binoculars from the southeast corner of Block D. You can see the profile clearly in the hour after sunset when the shadows extend far enough. He looked at the ridgeline, barely visible against the dark sky. Webb hasn't done that, he said. I don't know what Webb has done. He's our primary sniper. I know. She went back to her notebook. He watched her write for a moment, not many words, mostly numbers, the occasional diagram. Why'd you come back? He said. She stopped writing. The orders said temporary support. You could have declined. He paused. Most people who've been out a while decline. She closed the notebook. I made a promise, she said. To who? She stood up, picked up her rifle case from where it leaned against the wall, and looked at the sky in the east where the darkness was beginning its slow retreat. Someone who isn't around anymore, she said. She went inside to collect her kit. Decker sat for a while longer, looking at the ridge line. 3,100 meters. He'd done the math in his head. It was slow, but he got there. He sat with the number for a while. Then he went to find Holloway. They went in at 0415 and the trouble started at 0623. The route took them north-northeast across open ground, broken by wadi systems and scattered rock formations, then into a corridor of higher ground that funneled toward an objective compound roughly 6 kilometers from the wire. The intelligence was 4 days old, which in this kind of environment was old enough to be wrong in ways that mattered. Holloway had said as much in the briefing. Nobody argued with it. They moved anyway, because that was how this worked. Whitmore moved at the rear of the column, which was where she'd positioned herself without being asked. She carried the AXMC in a breakdown carry configuration, stock folded, barrel assembly separate, capable of being assembled in under 60 seconds. She also carried a short carbine for close work, slung across her chest, which Renfrew had noticed and said nothing about, because by this point even Renfrew was calibrated enough to notice that she was consistently 3 steps ahead of any comment he might make. The first crack came from above and to the northeast, then a second, then someone was on the ground. Petty Officer Okafor went down behind a rock formation, one hand pressed to his shoulder, his face doing the specific thing faces do when they're processing pain and suppressing panic at the same time. He was alive. The round had hit body armor at an angle. The damage was real but survivable, but he was down, and the second he went down the column's momentum broke. Contact, northeast. Holloway's voice on the radio, controlled and flat. Elevated position, approximately. Another shot. It came from a different angle. Webb was already scanning. He was on his belly behind a broken outcropping, his own platform extended, his eye to the glass. He had 40 seconds of experience on this scope per each of her 40 seconds. And he was fast, legitimately, professionally fast. But the problem was that the shooter was somewhere in 300 meters of broken terrain at an elevation differential of roughly 200 vertical feet, and the thermal signature of a prone human body at that distance in that terrain was within the margin of error of the imaging system Webb had at hand. Can't acquire, Webb said, tight and quiet. 2 possible positions. Another shot. Close. Dust jumped 6 inches from Holloway's boot. Multiple positions. He's moving. Webb's voice had a quality in it that Whitmore recognized, not fear, not panic, but the specific tension of a professional encountering a problem at the edge of his capability. Senior Chief, I need Whitmore. Holloway's voice. She was already moving. She'd been moving since the first shot, calculating. She'd triangulated from the sound of the reports, not the impact sounds, but the muzzle reports, which traveled differently, and she had a corridor. 60 meters wide at this range. That was too wide. She needed to narrow it. She set up behind a low rock shelf, assembled the AXMC in the specific darkness of a body that has performed a motion so many times that consciousness is no longer required to supervise it. Stock lock, barrel assembly, bolt carrier, glass. She was in position in 51 seconds, which was 9 seconds better than her average, and she told herself that was because the rock shelf was ideal, and not because her hands were moving faster from something she wouldn't call adrenaline. She put her eye to the glass. The terrain resolved. Heat shimmer, distance haze, the ridgeline broken into its component shadows, and she moved through them one by one, methodically, the way her father had taught her, not looking for a person, looking for the thing that isn't right, the angle that doesn't match, the shadow that moves when the wind can't explain it. She found the first position, empty, recently used, stone disturbed at the shooting edge, but empty. He'd moved. She found the second position, also empty. She breathed. She followed the vector from the second position. A shooter moving away from a compromised position moves along the path of least exposure, and the path of least exposure here went there. A shadow that moved 2 degrees opposite to the wind, at 3,774 meters. She adjusted. Wind component from the northwest at this altitude, she'd calculated it at 03306.2 kilometers per hour. Gusty. Average period of 12 seconds between gusts. She was in the middle of a gust window now, which meant she had approximately 7 seconds of relatively stable air. She breathed. She found her heartbeat. She found the space between heartbeats. She squeezed. The report was not loud. That was the thing nobody in the column ever quite remembered to expect how quiet a properly suppressed 338 Lapua was at close range. More of a heavy mechanical click than an explosion, and then the waiting. The waiting was the longest part. At 3,174 meters, even at supersonic velocity, the round was in flight for approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds, nobody spoke, nobody moved. The radio was open and silent. Somewhere on the ridgeline, the shadow that had moved against the wind had stopped. Then it moved again, wrong. Falling wrong. Hit. Decker said, very quietly. The radio crackled. Holloway's voice. Confirm? It confirmed. Webb was in his glass. A pause. Then, 3,000 meters. Silence on the radio. Not the silence of surprise, the silence of recalibration. The silence of people updating a model of the world that had just become insufficient. Renfrew was behind a rock 3 meters from Whitmore's position. He had a partial sightline on her. He could see the back of her head, the line of her shoulder, the stock pressed to her cheek. She hadn't moved. She was still in her position, still in the glass, still breathing. She was already scanning for the next one, because she'd identified 3 possible positions. She told Decker, approximately 60-meter corridor. A 3-position rotation within that corridor was standard doctrine for a lone elevated shooter in terrain like this. Position 1, empty. She'd confirmed it in the 40 seconds before she assembled the rifle. Position 2, the shot she'd just taken. Position 3, somewhere in the northeast quadrant of her scan, behind a rock shelf approximately 200 meters north of where the first shooter had been. She found it in the same way, not looking for a person, looking for the thing that wasn't right. The heat shimmer was too consistent on the eastern face of the shelf. Consistency in heat shimmer meant something horizontal was interrupting the normal vertical convection pattern. Something horizontal meant a prone figure. She adjusted 8 minutes of arc to the right and 12 up. The wind had shifted. She'd tracked the shift it started 17 seconds ago from a change in the flag at the motor pool, which was technically not visible from here but whose behavioral pattern she'd memorized over the hours of observation before dawn. New wind component. New calculation. She found the space between heartbeats. She squeezed. 4 seconds. Second hit confirmed. Webb's voice had a quality in it that was different now, something that wasn't quite anything he would have admitted to, a different position. How did she? 3rd position, Whitmore said. Her voice on the radio was as flat as it had been at the supply truck. North face, elevated shelf, roughly northeast of my current position. Advise no movement for. She paused, calculating 90 seconds. Silence. Then Holloway. Why 90 seconds? 3rd shooter, if there is one, will have heard the 2nd report and is currently deciding whether to move or stay. Moving exposes them. Staying keeps them in a fixed position. She paused again. In this terrain, in this heat, the rational choice is to move. I'm waiting for them to make the rational choice. 83 seconds later, something moved on the north face. She was already in the glass. She found the space between heartbeats. She did not miss. The radio stayed quiet for a long time after the 3rd shot, not because anyone had muted it, because nobody had anything to say. Okafor was being treated by the corpsman. The shoulder wound was confirmed as non-critical. A fracture to the scapular process and significant soft tissue damage, survivable and unambiguously painful, the kind of wound that ends a deployment but not a life. He was making noise in the way that men make noise when they're hurt and don't want to admit it, short tight sounds through clenched teeth. Whitmore broke down the AXMC. She did it the same way she'd assembled it, without ceremony, without apparent attention. The hands moving through their practice sequence while her eyes swept the terrain in a slow, methodical arc. She was cataloging. She did this after every engagement. Had done it since her father had explained it to her when she was 12 years old in the backfield of their property in eastern Tennessee. After the shot, you look. Not for threats, for information. What did you miss? What did you not account for? Where were you lucky and where were you good? She had not been lucky today. Decker came to her position. He moved carefully, still treating the terrain as active, which it probably wasn't, but probably wasn't was not the same as wasn't. He crouched beside her. 3 shots, he said. Yes, 3 different positions. 3 different wind calculations. Approximately. He was quiet for a moment. In the distance, the corpsman was speaking in the steady, professional patter of someone who has done this before, reassuring Okafor with words that were less information than rhythm. Where did you learn that? Decker said. She latched the case. My father. Then school. Then a place I'm not permitted to name. What school? She looked at him. The kind that doesn't have a name either, she said. He looked out at the ridgeline. The sun was fully up now, and the desert had committed to its daily project of becoming as hostile as possible. The heat came off the ground in waves that bent the air into mirages, pools of silver that retreated as you moved toward them. Renfrew, Decker said. He said you wouldn't last a minute. She picked up the rifle case. I heard him, she said. He's young. He's not. I know, she said. It's all right. She stood. She looked at the ridgeline the same way she'd looked at everything since she arrived, with the steady, information-gathering gaze of someone for whom looking was a form of work. Renfrew was right about one thing, she said. Decker waited. I don't belong here, she said. I haven't belonged anywhere in a while. I'm here because someone asked me to be, and that's the only reason. She picked up her carbine and her kit and began walking back toward the column. Decker watched her go. He stayed crouched in the shade of the rock shelf for another moment, looking at the place where she had been set up, the worn patch of dirt where her elbows had rested, the small, precise angle of her position relative to the northeast. She'd set up in the exact right spot, not approximately the right spot. The right spot, the one that gave the best simultaneous sightline to all 3 positions in the elevation corridor. She'd found that spot in under 90 seconds, in the middle of an active engagement, in terrain she'd only studied from a distance in the dark before dawn. He thought about the notebook full of numbers. He stood up and followed her. They were back at the base by midday. Okafor was medivaced within the hour. The shoulder required surgery and stabilization, nothing the forward position could provide. He went calmly, The way soldiers who have made their peace with the job go signing things, saying the right things to the right people, making a joke that wasn't quite funny but was the right kind of unfunny. He stopped next to Whitmore on his way to the medevac bird. "Good shooting," he said. "I'm sorry you got hit," she said. He looked at her. "You didn't hit me. I know. I'm still sorry." He seemed to think about that. Then he nodded once and went to the helicopter. The debrief happened in Holloway's makeshift operations room, a repurposed storage space with a folding table, 2 laptops, and a whiteboard that had been colonized by tactical diagrams for so long that the diagrams were now permanent, ghost layers visible beneath whatever new information was written over them. Webb was there. Decker was there. Finch was there. Renfrew was there. Renfrew sat at the far end of the table from Whitmore and spent the first 5 minutes of the debrief studying the surface of the table with the focus of a man reviewing every careless word he'd said in the last 24 hours. He didn't look up when Holloway began. Holloway ran through the engagement. He was thorough and unhurried, the way experienced officers are when they're building an institutional record not just for this debrief but for the pattern recognition that might save someone's life later. He covered the route, the contact timing, Okafor's wound and medical response, the tactical response to the initial suppression failure, and the decision to employ Whitmore rather than adjust Webb's position. He didn't editorialize. He named facts. When he got to the sniper engagement, he turned to Whitmore. "Walk me through the decision process," he said. She did. She was not a natural speaker. Her sentences were economical to the point of austerity, stripped of everything that wasn't load-bearing information. But the logic was exact. She walked them through the triangulation of muzzle reports, the identification of the probable position corridor, the decision to wait for assembly rather than use the carbine at range, the atmospheric calculations, the decision to scan for position 3 before the engagement was confirmed over. She explained the 90-second pause, the shooter psychology of a compromised position, the rational calculus of movement versus stillness, the window during which movement became the highest probability event. When she finished, the room was quiet in a specific way. Not confused quiet, not uncomfortable quiet, the quiet of people absorbing something that was technically correct in every measurable dimension and somehow still surprising. Webb spoke first. "The atmospheric data," he said. "You calculated the wind at altitude using the surface observation from this morning." "Yes. At 3,174 meters, there's typically a gradient differential between surface and elevated wind." "Yes. I accounted for approximately 18% variance based on the terrain profile between here and the ridgeline. The northeast spur has a convective channel that accelerates wind at the saddle between the first and second peaks. I mapped it last night." Webb looked at her for a long moment. "I've never made a shot at that distance in active wind conditions," he said. This was not a concession so much as information, offered plainly, man to professional. "I've made 2, she said. Both times the atmospheric calculation was the thing that mattered most, not the mechanical execution. Holloway looked at her. "Where?" he said. "I can't tell you." He nodded. He hadn't expected her to. "All right," he said, and moved on. After the debrief, Renfrew found her at the same table where she'd assembled her equipment the night before. She was writing in the notebook again after action data, the numbers that would tell her tomorrow what she'd done right and wrong today. He stood at the end of the table. She didn't look up. "I was wrong," he said. "She wrote something in the notebook. About you not lasting. About I was wrong." She put down the pen and looked at him. There was nothing in her expression that he could use as a guide. No anger, no forgiveness, no satisfaction. Just attention. "I know you were," she said. He'd expected something more, some form of release or completion. He didn't get it. "I'm sorry," he said. She picked up the pen. "Renfrew," she said. "Yeah. I didn't come here to be underestimated. I also didn't come here to be vindicated." She looked at him once more, briefly, before returning to the notebook. "I came here because someone needed me to be here. That's all this is." He stood for a moment longer. Then he nodded, though she wasn't watching, and walked away. 2 weeks later, Webb found her at the equipment bench again. It was late past midnight, and the base had settled into its nighttime rhythms, the particular quiet of people who are professional enough to rest when the environment permits it, because they know from experience that the environment will not always permit it. He carried 2 cups of the terrible coffee that the forward position produced from a machine that had been old when it arrived and was now essentially archaeological. The coffee was scorched and too thick and tasted vaguely of the plastic casing that surrounded the heating element, which had been cracking for 2 years according to the maintenance log that nobody had acted on. He set 1 cup in front of her. She looked at it. Then she picked it up. He sat across from her. "I looked you up," he said. She said nothing. "Your record, I mean, the unclassified parts." She drank the coffee, which was bad enough to make most people wince. She didn't wince. She had grown up drinking her father's cowboy coffee grounds boiled directly in the pot over a propane flame and had developed a functional immunity to the concept of bad coffee. "There's not much in the unclassified parts," she said. "No, there isn't." He looked at his own cup. "But there's enough to know what you were." "What unit?" What he paused, choosing. "What you were doing before you stepped away." She waited. "There's a note," he said, "in the file. Not an official entry, just a note. It says, "You declined a commendation 3 times. Yes. Why?" She thought about how to answer this. Not because the answer was complicated, the answer was simple, but because the simple answers were sometimes the hardest to say clearly without making them sound like something they weren't. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She wasn't making a statement about institutions or recognition or the machinery of military honor. The reason was smaller and more personal than any of that, and she preferred it to stay that way. "A man named Robert Caulfield," she said. "He was my spotter for 6 years. He died in the same valley where I made the shot that would have earned the commendation. He died 12 minutes before the shot, because we were in a compromised position and someone had made an intelligence error, and in those 12 minutes she stopped." Webb was quiet. "In those 12 minutes, I couldn't do anything," she said. "I had the rifle. I had the sight picture. I had everything except a viable target to engage, and he died anyway." She looked at the coffee cup. "You don't take a commendation for a shot that didn't save the person you were there with. She shook her head. "That's not what the shot was for." Outside, the desert was doing what deserts did at night, breathing coolly, moving slowly, making sounds that were only audible in the absence of everything else. Somewhere, a piece of loose metal sheeting on one of the outbuildings flexed in the wind, a faint ticking that came and went in irregular intervals. "Why did you come back?" Webb said. "The promise Decker said you mentioned a promise." She looked at him. He was waiting with the patient, precise attention of a man who was genuinely asking, not constructing a next question or framing a next move, just asking. The way people asked when they actually wanted to know. "Caulfield had a daughter," she said. 7 years old when he died. She's 11 now. She paused. "He asked me once, over a fire somewhere we weren't supposed to be, what I would do if something happened to him. It was a soldier question, the kind you ask because the answer matters but you never expect to use it." She was quiet for a moment. "I told him I'd make sure she knew who her father was, what he did, that he was—" She stopped again, briefly. "That he was someone worth knowing." She put the coffee cup down. "I've been working on that. Writing things down, collecting the records that aren't classified." She looked at the notebook. "This is part of it. Being here, doing what he trained beside me to do, staying in the work, even when it's easier not to." Webb nodded. He didn't say anything, which was the right thing. After a while, she asked him about the shot he'd made that was in the training manuals, the distance, the conditions, the mechanics of it. He told her, plainly and without embellishment, and she listened the same way. They talked for an hour in the specific language of people who have committed their lives to a narrow and serious discipline, precise, quiet, occasionally punctuated by numbers that would have meant nothing to anyone outside the conversation. When he left, he said, "I underestimated you." She looked